for today's movie review, I'll be reviewing the 1991 black comedy horror movie Nothing But Trouble, the first and only movie to be ever directed by Dan Aykroyd of Ghostbusters fame. And the production behind this movie is very lengthy. Also, if you want to get a better idea of the production of the movie, I would recommend watching Good Bad Flix's Exploring Nothing But Trouble video, as that goes into more detail, but I'll try to sum up the general tidbits of that video to the best of my ability. And it goes something like this. Sometime in 1978, Dan Aykroyd was on a road trip and he got pulled over for a speeding ticket, and instead of paying the money to the police officer took him to the local justice of the peace for the trial. And while there, the justice of the peace decided to invite Aykroyd for some tea, and Aykroyd spent several hours with this justice of the peace. And this event was just so bizarre, it just left a really big impression with Dan Aykroyd, as he would just remember it being one of the most bizarre events that ever occurred in his life. Fast forward to 1987 with Hellraiser hitting theaters. Aykroyd, along with his brother and producer Robert K. West, attended a screening of Hellraiser and noticed that a lot of the people in the audience were laughing at the movie, and this inspired the three of them to come up with a horror comedy along the lines of Beetlejuice mixed with Texas Chainsaw Massacre, along with incorporating Dan Aykroyd's bizarre experience with that justice of the peace that formed the basis for this movie, which would lead into the movie having a rather notorious production history, given that the movie constantly went over budget. You had the lead actor Chevy Chase constantly verbally abusing everyone on set, to having Dan Aykroyd himself having some health problems, because not only was he directing star in the movie, but he was also playing two different characters that required a lot of heavy makeup. And sometime after the movie was completed, it was released in theaters and flopped heavily at the box office. And because of the bad experiences Dan Aykroyd felt during the production of this movie, he never wanted to direct another movie ever again. Although, according to some sources, apparently he never wanted to direct the movie in the first place, given that he passed the movie script to several directors who all turned it down, and he forced himself to direct the movie. And as time went on, the movie eventually faded into obscurity, to such a point that it became a fever dream movie. Now, what do I mean by this? A fever dream movie is a movie that you saw at a very young age, and remember bits and pieces of the movie that were so bizarre that you thought you had hallucinated parts of it, or thought it was just a dream you had from a long time ago, until you find some piece of evidence that the movie itself actually did exist. Nothing But Trouble, for me, is that kind of movie, because I do remember watching this as a very young kid who probably shouldn't have even watched the movie in the first place, and I swear there are just points in time where I definitely do vividly remember some parts of the movie, but I could never remember what the movie was called or about, and thought the movie as such. I thought it was just something that I came up with in one of my dreams, but it wasn't until I saw, again, that video by Good Bad Flix about the production history of Nothing But Trouble, where I sat there and went, oh my god, I actually do remember this movie. And I looked at the trailer. Turns out I wasn't the only one, because I remember looking at the comments to that trailer, and I kept seeing all these repeated comments of, my god, I thought this was a fever dream I had as a kid. Turns out everybody thought this movie was a fever dream. And since it has gone on to having a small cult following, which begs the question, is the movie worthy of being branded as a cult classic? As for the plot of the movie, a group of yuppies consisting of a financier, a lawyer, and two wealthy Brazilian siblings attend a road trip in order for a lawyer to attend her business meeting. While on their road trip, the group of yuppies soon stumble upon a small rundown in the middle of nowhere town called Valkenvania. And after accidentally running a stop sign, the group of yuppies are soon confronted by a 106-year-old judge who decides to hold them prisoner inside the courthouse, which also doubles as his own home, in order to judge them properly the next day. And as the night progresses, the group of yuppies discover the longer they stay in the courtroom's prison, they encounter a series of booby-traps and other bizarre members of the judge's family. Can the group of yuppies survive the night, or does the judge have other plans in store for them? Now, in terms of what I liked about the movie, I thought the movie moved at I don't want to say decent pace, but it moved fast enough that I didn't think the movie overstayed its welcome. Even though I feel like there are some scenes that occur throughout the movie that didn't need to be there, but I thought the pacing was generally good for the most part. Another aspect of the movie I liked is the visual aesthetics to Valkenvania itself, or more specifically the scrapyard, where a good majority of the movie takes place in, because you could tell this is where all of the money went for the movie's budget, because according to some sources, apparently Dan Aykroyd, along with some of the other members of the film crew, kept buying a lot of junk to make Dan Aykroyd's character of Judge Vulcanizer's home to make it look like an authentic junkyard, because Dan Aykroyd, along with some of the other people behind the scenes, kept calling up people that had junk or really bizarre sculptures they had around their yards. For example, apparently there was this one guy that had 150 toasters or refrigerators, and they called him up asking if they could use his toasters or refrigerators, and the guy asked, how many would you like? And supposedly Dan Aykroyd just bought all of the toasters or refrigerators, and they just kept doing that for all these objects, which also include a homemade roller coaster that's used for the Mr. Bone Strip It execution device that is seen throughout the movie. And it definitely gives a very lived-in feel to this location. To give you an idea of what this location looks like, it reminded me a lot of Bartertown from Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. But imagine if Bartertown existed before the apocalypse, and you get the same idea. And to continue on with the visual aesthetics, not only does this apply to the geographical location of Valkenvania, but this also applies to the makeup done for Dan Aykroyd in the movie, because he plays two characters, one of them being the main villain of the movie, Judge Vulcanizer, and the other one being Boa, which is a giant mutant baby, which I'll talk about later. And I think the makeup done for Dan Aykroyd's character looks pretty good, in a very grotesque kind of way, as it was intended to. And then you have some of the weird contractions that are seen throughout Judge Vulcanizer's house, mainly the table during the rather infamous dinner scene, where we have the characters eating hot dogs, and parts of the table open up, revealing this train that goes around the entire table that has trank hearts filled with nothing but condiments. And it's just such a bizarre visual to see in the movie, but at the same time, you could tell someone actually had to go out of their way to make the table open up and actually have that train go around the table. So there was at least a lot of visual creativity put into the movie itself, in terms of both the geographical location, the makeup done for Dan Aykroyd's characters, along with some of the contractions used by the main villain of the movie. Now, in terms of aspects of the movie I have mixed feelings on, the humor, okay, I'm gonna be honest, the humor is all over the place, because remember, on top of this movie being a horror movie, it was also supposed to be a black comedy as well, and all of the jokes that were intended to be funny in this, in my opinion, were not very funny. Yet, there are just some moments that occur throughout the movie that are so bizarre that you kind of can't help but laugh at it. And what I mean by that, I mean as in, I'm not laughing with the movie, I'm more laughing at the movie for ironic reasons. For example, I think one of the funniest parts of the movie is when we get to see the Mr. Bone Stripper in action for the first time, because when it happens, you have no idea what's going on, and when it does happen, you're just left with this weird feeling of just confusion, because you have no idea what just occurred. For example, there's this reoccurring joke revolved around Judge Vulcanizer's nose, where at 2 points in time throughout the movie, for a split second, it looks like a penis, and there's no reason why it happens. It's just 1 second, it looks like a penis, next second, it looks normal. I don't know why it was a thing. I didn't think it was funny, I just thought it was just really odd, if anything else. Another aspect of the movie I have mixed feelings on is the combination of the cast and acting, because when you look at the cast of this movie, it's a pretty good cast, because you have Chevy Chase, who was predominantly known for his comedies ranging from Caddyshack to National Lampoon's Vacation. Then you have Dan Aykroyd of Ghostbusters fame playing the main villain, along with one of the two giant mutant babies, which I'll talk about later. You got John Candy, who appeared in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, Spaceballs, and Uncle Buck. And then you got Demi Moore, who just came off Ghost from 1990. So you have a pretty good cast. It's just the acting for certain actors is mixed across the board. Because you have Demi Moore, despite not working with the best material, you could tell she was at least trying to put in a good performance. With Dan Aykroyd's acting, on the other hand, you could tell he was having a blast playing Judge Valkenvania, but I think the energy he brings to the role is not what I think should have been required of the role, because it just felt like Dan Aykroyd was channeling Michael Keaton's Beetlejuice for the role of Judge Valkenvania as opposed to his own unique take on the character. That said, his performance as the giant mutant baby Bobo feels appropriately dumb. Then you have John Candy's acting. I'm not gonna lie, I haven't seen him in a lot of movies other than the aforementioned movies I just mentioned, but I feel that the acting he was given here, even though I think it's impressive he was playing two different characters, it feels like he wasn't really putting much effort into either character. It just felt like he was playing the role to get a paycheck sort of thing. That said, however, his acting is a little more consistent and tolerable than someone like Chevy Chase, because as I kind of briefly mentioned in my intro, Chevy Chase was apparently a big problem behind the scenes where he constantly was verbally abusive towards everybody on set, even Dan Aykroyd himself, despite being friends with him. And this got the film crew so furious at Chevy Chase that one of the crew members actually threatened to drop a brick on Chevy Chase's head if he ever spoke to Dan Aykroyd like that again. Because when you really look at his acting in the movie, you could tell he didn't even want to be there. And the only reason why he even took up the role in the first place was because he was friends with Dan Aykroyd and nothing else. Then you have the two actors who play the Brazilianaire sibling duo, and their acting's a little mixed, because on the one hand, their characters, which I have problems with that I'll talk about later, are annoying. And I think the two actors playing those characters play the siblings in a way that I think are appropriate for the roles. However, just because the actors succeed at playing an annoying character does not mean I'm letting their acting off easy, because annoying is still annoying. Another aspect of the movie I have mixed feelings on is the horror elements, because on pen and paper, there is some decent ideas for a horror movie here. Everything from having a judge lock you up to having the main cast of characters discover a room filled with various IDs from different decades, among other things that occur throughout the movie. And I started thinking, this actually could have been a good horror movie. But because the movie also tried to incorporate a lot of comedy at the same time, the horror elements don't feel particularly scary and have no weight to it, because the movie's more focused on the humor than it is the horror. Or when you do have a moment in time where they try to be scary, it doesn't feel earned. To me, I feel that Nothing But Trouble is one of those movies that honestly could benefit from a remake if done in the right hands. Now, in terms of what I disliked about the movie, my first problem with the movie is honestly a nitpick, that being the movie's title, because Nothing But Trouble to me sounds really generic, to a point that if I was to mention Nothing But Trouble to people, they probably just think it is just a run-of-the-mill comedy. Because it doesn't really give the movie a sense of identity. The only reason why the movie ended up being called Nothing But Trouble had to do with the notorious behind-the-scenes drama going on, because the executives over at Warner Brothers kept looking at the movie going over budget, and they got concerned, and they just kept telling them, hey, can you pull back on the budget a bit? And over time, they just got fed up, and they're like, this movie's nothing but trouble to us. And that is why the movie's called Nothing But Trouble, because the movie was quite literally nothing but trouble for the executives, because the movie kept going over budget. Personally, I would have called the movie something along the lines of Welcome to Valkenvania, or simply Valkenvania. That gives the movie a sense of identity, at least, as opposed to Nothing But Trouble. Now, the first legit problem of the movie is that the entire movie is so pointless that it didn't need to happen. Because the reason why the characters go on this road trip in the first place had to do with Demi Moore's character Diane wanting to go to Atlantic City to consult a client for reasons. Now, fast forward to somewhere around an hour into the movie, we now get more context. And it turns out Diane's client isn't just a client making a bad decision, but in reality, her client was someone she was in a relationship with, and she wanted to drive down to Atlantic City to dump him, which, in my opinion, is a really dumb thing to do. But here's the real kicker. That last tidbit comes out of nowhere. I mean, the only hint we get at is the first time we see the main character talking to her on the elevator, and we see she's crying. We don't know about what, but all we know is she's just crying and we don't know why. And then you get that tidbit when she's telling him that, yeah, the client's actually really my lover. And I just started thinking, where did this come from? There's no build up to this. I just think that maybe throughout the movie they should have thrown in some more information here and there, like, oh, maybe she was in a relationship or talked about a past experience. Because the moment she really does reveal why she wanted to go down to Atlantic City in the first place just feels like it came out of nowhere. And to continue on with how pointless this movie is, there is either scenes or characters that show up that didn't even need to happen or be there in the first place. One example being a car chase that occurs in the first third. Because remember, the reason why our main cast of characters even confront the judge in the first place had to do with the fact that the main character ran a stop sign and nothing else. So you literally have this entire sequence where the sheriff constable goes after them to pull them over, and you quite literally have the two Brazilian siblings, which I will discuss in a few minutes, telling Chris to, hey man, this car could totally outspeed that police officer there. Put the pedal to the metal. And so the main character does, leading into this entire car chase, and when the car chase ends, quite literally the sheriff constable's like, hey man, the reason why I wanted to pull you over in the first place was because you ran a stop sign, and you know what, if you just come with me, I am going to just not mention the car chase we've had to the judge. That way you can be on your way because you look like reasonable people. Even the movie just acknowledged, hey man, this scene didn't even need to happen in the first place. Because one way or the other, our main cast of characters were going to end up going to meet Judge Alvin Valkenheiser. So why even bother having that car chase in there to begin with? Then you have the two giant mutant babies that confront Diane in the last third of the movie. And I just started wondering, why? Why are these two even here? Now, according to the IMDb trivia page for the movie, apparently around the time of the production of the movie, Dan Aykroyd was having these series of weird dreams, one of them revolved around two giant mutant babies, and decided to incorporate them into the movie, because during production, he kept talking to a lot of the film crew, and everyone always seemed to have some kind of absurd idea that they wanted to incorporate into the movie, and Dan Aykroyd incorporated some of these ideas into the movie. But I'm taking this bit of information with a grain of salt, because also on the same IMDb trivia page for Nothing But Trouble, there's another piece of trivia that states that Dan Aykroyd apparently based the two mutant babies on two overweight children in a family who also weren't allowed in the house. So I have no idea whether or not the two mutant babies were something that was conjured up by Dan Aykroyd himself from his dreams, or were these two based on two actual individuals that Dan Aykroyd knew about. I have no idea. But as far as the actual mutant babies are concerned, I just don't understand why they're there. Because they don't serve any purpose in the movie, and there's no build-up to them whatsoever. So having these two in the movie, I could have done without. Also, the movie kind of breaks its own rule with these two characters, because when Diana first meets them, they tell her, yeah, we're not allowed in the house. Yet, during the final 5 minutes of the movie when we see Valkenvania go up in smoke, we literally see the two of them inside of the house. Then you have the point in time where a musical number occurs. Now, sure, I understand why it happens, because the judge literally asks the group of musicians to play some music, in which they do. But how it happens, it straight up feels like the movie stopped being a movie for a tidbit and became a music video. It's very distracting, to say the least. To get an idea of how distracting it is, imagine you're watching Spider-Man 3. And at some point in the movie, you get the music video to Snow Patrol's Signal Fire mixed into the movie for a couple minutes, and then it cuts back to the actual movie, and you get the same idea. Also, what makes this musical number even weirder is the actual group of musicians itself, because before I go any further, I'm something of a music illiterate, so I'm not really familiar with this group's discography, but the actual group of musicians that appear in this movie was an alternative hip-hop group called Digital Underground. And honestly, I don't really know much about Digital Underground, other than the fact that one of the members of the group was Tupac. And what makes his appearance in this movie even weirder is that according to some sources, supposedly this was Tupac's first theatrical debut in a movie. Just let that sink in and you get an idea of how weird this whole musical number really is. Another problem that I have with the movie revolves around the two Brazilianaire siblings. Because my god, from the moment they appear, they are quite literally the most obnoxious pair of characters in the entire movie. And these two characters are just really terrible from a writing standpoint for a couple reasons. Reason number one, as I mentioned a few moments ago, they're just really obnoxious. Second, they really don't get personal boundaries because of how entitled they make themselves out to be. Because the reason why our main characters of Chris and Diane even decided to go on a road trip in the first place because Diane wanted to borrow Chris's car to confront her client. And the whole idea was that these two just wanted to have a road trip to themselves without any passengers. And lo and behold, these two siblings basically invite themselves. And not only that, but they also try to constantly take over the road trip to a point where they try to basically be like, hey, why don't we go to your penthouse, or oh, why don't we stop at this location or that location? I mean, you're our host after all. Basically presenting themselves as being the more important characters than Diane in that exact moment, putting their needs before hers. Reason number three, remember that car chase I mentioned earlier? Well, they are the reasons why they caused it in the first place. And then for my fourth and final reason, now, if this was any other movie, usually you would have some obnoxious character get all the main cast of characters into some kind of situation. And then at one point, they try to leave and they get their comeuppance. This movie, on the other hand, these two characters cause a lot of problems for our main duo. And there's a point where you think, okay, this is the point where they're gonna get what's coming to them. But no, they get out of Valkenvania scot-free, leaving our two main characters to suffer. And not only that, but they just left their two colleagues for dead. And they're the ones that get the happy ending. And speaking of the ending, my final problem with the movie is the ending itself. Because I think it went on a little too long. Personally, if it just ended with Chris and Diane escaping on the train, that would have been a good way to end the movie. But no, the rest of the movie just feels like an afterthought in that sense where, alright, these two have to go to the police. They go to the police, they explain their story, and then the police bring them to Judge Vulcanizer, which then leads into a plot twist of, hey, the police actually don't mind working for the judge, and then at that exact moment, an earthquake occurs, leading to some other shenanigans, and I sat there thinking, really? This is the way the movie's gonna end? It not only felt anticlimactic, but it also went on much longer than it should have. So for my final verdict of Nothing But Trouble, see, this is one of those cases where I'm more in love with the visual aesthetic because of how ugly it is. And despite supporting a very decent cast, the acting is mixed across the board. Everything else, however, is all over the place. Because for a movie that's trying to be a black horror comedy, it's not really that scary, nor do I think it's that funny. Or if it's funny in a I'm laughing more at the movie than with the movie kind of way. I think Nothing But Trouble is just one of those cases where I think the script needed a few more rewrites. Because this could have been a more decent movie. It just is a complete mess in regards to tone, plot, and certain characters. So overall, Nothing But Trouble is a entertainingly bad movie. And before I give my final rating, what did everybody else have to say about Nothing But Trouble? Okay, so the movie got generally negative reception. I mean, I know the movie was bad, but I didn't think it was that bad. And so for my final rating of Nothing But Trouble, I give it a 2 out of 5. So, do you think Nothing But Trouble deserves to get remade? And see you later.